This video covers Greater God theology. Greater God theology was, for several centuries, a very powerful religious argument for evolution and a naturalistic origins. Now, we looked at Thomas Burnet, a 17th century Anglican cleric who made the argument from dysteleology. Burnet also made the Greater God argument. What Burnet said was, consider two clockmakers. One clockmaker makes a clock, winds it up, sets it down, it works. The other clockmaker makes a clock, sets it down, it doesn't work. It just sits there. Once every hour he has to stick his finger on the hands and move the hands of the clock. Which is the greater clockmaker? Well, the answer is obvious, the one who made the clock that works. Which is the greater God? The God who makes a universe that just works on its own, by itself, or the God who makes a universe that he has to go in and fiddle with it, put in a divine finger and make things work? The Greater God argument. In a nutshell, very simple. Lutherans took this argument much further and developed it quite a bit and made it very compelling. It was a very powerful argument in the hands of Lutherans such as Gottfried Leibniz and Christian Wolff into the 18th century. So I want to say a few words about Leibniz and Wolff. You need to understand these things to get a feeling for the power and the strength of this argument, and then it reappears in Anglican thought with the development of the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin. So for Leibniz, for context, we'll go back to Malebranche, Nicholas Malebranche. We looked at him earlier with parsimonious creation. Now remember, so what Malebranche said was God desires to create a universe with little or no natural evil. Malebranche was thinking about the problem of evil, and natural evil in particular. So God desires to make a universe with little or no natural evil. However, there's a competing thought for God. He also desires to minimize the complexity of the creation acts. So God can create a universe with little or no evil, but it would require a lot of complexity in the creation acts. Now notice that I said creation acts, not creation. God can create a universe with little or no evil, but it would require much complexity in the creation acts, and God doesn't want to do that. God wants simplicity in the creation acts. So to create a world with little or no evil would require a lot of one-offs, a lot of particulars, complexities in the creation acts. So you would have a lot of complexity in the creation acts in order to achieve a small amount of natural evil. On the other hand, if you had a very simple creation acts, then you're going to end up with inefficiencies, problems, and so forth, a lot of natural evil. So God has these two competing interests in this trade-off. Maybe God looks for a happy medium somewhere and gets, something where it's a little bit of both. So that was the trade-off that Malebranche described in his explanation for why there is natural evil. The reason was, it's not that God can't create a world with little or no evil, but that you're going to have all this complexity in the creation acts. Now there's a problem with this formulation. Maybe you noticed it. It was a problem that bothered Leibniz, and Leibniz was out to solve. The problem is, what's the solution? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? How much evil? How much complexity in the creation acts? Malebranche has set up a system where the solution is arbitrary. God has set up a problem that has no unique solution. God is now facing an arbitrary decision that he has created. It makes God look to be like a capricious God. He's just going to choose. I'll just do this because I feel like it. And that's not good. According to Leibniz, God will never do anything without sufficient reason. And this is the principle of sufficient reason. God only acts, only decides, only makes decisions with sufficient reason. And Malebranche's theodicy, his solution to the problem of natural evil, violated the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. It wasn't good. So Leibniz was going to be a lot more careful about this and set this problem up so that it has a unique solution. So here's what Leibniz said. First, for this problem of can God create a world with no evil? No, the answer is no. According to Leibniz, you can't do that, because in order for something to be other than God, it has to be imperfect in some way. It can't be perfect, otherwise it's indistinguishable from God. So God creates a universe, it's going to have some evil. Now, the next question is, why so much evil? We seem to have a lot of evil, a lot of natural evil. Tsunamis, earthquakes, parasites, diseases, all kinds of problems. Why so much? And so for that, Leibniz, now remember, Leibniz, along with Isaac Newton, he was a co-discoverer of calculus. And the whole idea behind calculus is you find these optimum points, the maximum or the minimum of a function. You take the derivative. Remember that from your high school or college math class. You take the derivative, find the optimum point. So that's a unique solution there. So for Leibniz, God was a good calculus guy, because what he said was he set up an optimization problem. God had an optimization problem. Instead of Malebranche's formulation, Leibniz's formulation was God wanted to maximize the ratio of good to evil. In other words, you have a lot more good than you have evil. It's not minimizing evil as an absolute, but it's that ratio of good to evil. And so as you introduce evil into the world, you make a world that has some evil, the good shoots up at a faster rate. Because you can do all kinds of great things, but you're going to have some problems, some inefficiencies along the wayside. And then there's a law of diminishing return, and evil starts to gain up. And so that ratio, according to Leibniz, was a function that had an optimum point. And so God could choose this optimum point. It is in keeping with the PSR, principle of sufficient reason. There is a unique solution. God is not capricious. He's not arbitrary. He's not presenting himself with an arbitrary decision. There's a single point at which God selects for the world. And this is the best of all worlds. So there's an infinity of worlds that God could have made. The one that he made is the best of all worlds, the best possible worlds. It's the optimum point, straight out of calculus. Now later, Voltaire, in his book Candide, panned Leibniz with his character Dr. Pangloss, who always saw the best of all things. They went around the world seeing all these terrible disasters, terrible things, all this natural evil, and Dr. Pangloss always saw it as, this is for the best. It's all for the best. It's the best possible world. But in spite of Voltaire's satire, I hope you can appreciate and see Leibniz's point. And it's a good point, actually. It's an interesting point. God doesn't present himself with arbitrary, capricious decisions. He does things according to sufficient reason. Let me give you another example of how this plays out, and does make a lot of sense. And this would be the case of Isaac Newton and his physics and his description of how the solar system works. You remember Copernicus in the 1500s had argued for a heliocentrism. The planets rotate around the sun. Then in the next century, early in the 17th century, Galileo further promoted that idea of heliocentrism. Galileo was certain about this, argued vigorously for this. The planets go around the sun. Then along came Newton, and he applied physics to it and kind of came up with mathematical formulations describing how this would work in mathematical detail with his Newtonian physics, including his inverse square law of gravity. The gravitational force between two bodies is the product of the masses of these two bodies divided by the distance squared between them, multiplied by a constant, the gravitational constant. That gives you the force between these two bodies. And with that, along with his Newtonian physics, F equals ma, Newton could describe the motions of the planets, including the fact that they were in ellipses, as Kepler had said they would be. And so it was a great breakthrough. Newtonian physics explained a lot of things. Newton was careful to say that it did not explain how the solar system arose in the first place. It explained how the solar system operated. But there was one fly in the ointment. There was one problem that Newton grappled with and he couldn't quite figure out. And that was, when you have these planets going around the sun, they're all going around at different speeds. Mercury on the inside goes the fastest, and then Venus, and then Earth, and then Mars, and Jupiter. So you've got these different like spinning plates here going around the sun, so to speak. And every once in a while they align. Every once in a while Mercury and Venus, Mercury passes Venus on the inside. Every once in a while that happens when Venus is passing Earth. So you have a triple alignment. Every once in a while that happens when Earth is passing Mars. Now you have 4 planets aligned with the sun. Every once in a while that happens when Mars is passing Jupiter on the inside, and so forth and so on. So you can get these planetary alignments. Now the problem with these planetary alignments, according to Newton, was you're going to have a gravitational summation, a summation of these gravitational tugs, and they're going to be applying more force than usual, and you can have perturbations. A planet can be perturbed out of its orbit. If you get a little bit of a perturbation, according to Newton, that could send that planet onto a different path and end up turning the nice, finely tuned solar system into a pinball game with planets careening off in different directions and this thing going chaotic. So you could have a problem, according to Newton. The system was unstable. It was a beautiful system, really cool, it worked, a beautiful machine, but in the long run, every once in a while, over eons of time, this thing can go unstable. It could easily be fixed with just a slight nudge, because again, these are just slight tweaks, the nudges of the gravitational summations that are occurring when you have these alignments. Planets are just nudged a little bit out of their orbit. All it needs is a little bit of a tweak to keep it in its orbit. Newton didn't know how we could be here. How can the solar system be here with this problem, these instabilities? So the only thing he could think of was, well, maybe God occasionally puts a divine finger in there and tweaks it to keep it in order. Do you get the problem here? Think back to how we started this video with Thomas Burnett and the clockmaker example. The better clockmaker makes the clock that works. The worse clockmaker has to put his finger in there and adjust it every once in a while. That's exactly what Newton was proposing. This sent Leibniz off into left field. He was very much against this idea, as you might expect from what I've described so far. For Leibniz, God would never create a system that then later requires him to come in and kind of arbitrarily, every once in a while, oh, I need to fix this thing this way. Just like following Burnett. This would be unacceptable for Leibniz. Leibniz argued vigorously against Newton's idea that this solar system was unstable. He didn't have a solution to the problem, but he said this is blasphemy. Very serious charge he made against Newton. Newton was blasphemous in his suggestion that God would have to would set up a system that required that later tweaking. Now, at a distance of several centuries, I suspect many of you will see the point and kind of agree, as I would, with Leibniz. I think Leibniz makes a good point. It does seem odd to think of God doing that. That doesn't quite seem the way it would work. But it's a religious concern. It's a religious consideration. It's not scientific. It's something that we would just feel intuitively. It doesn't seem like God would set up a system that he would then later need to go in and tweak like that. But it was an issue at the time. And I hope you see the power then of the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, and this kind of thinking, this greater God sort of theology, thinking that God is going to set things up the right way to begin with. The greater God is going to do it that way, and that kind of makes sense. So it's my point is that the PSR and greater God theology can be very powerful and convince you you've got the right answer. You're on the right track. You know what God would and wouldn't do. These are very powerful theologies. Now, about a generation later came Christian Wolff, a leading Lutheran thinker in the early 18th century, 1700s. Wolff was a Lutheran, as I mentioned. He considered himself to be an Orthodox Lutheran Christian, but he really advanced this greater God idea. He very strongly promoted this idea that a God who creates the world with miracles is a lesser God. It requires lesser power. It requires more power to create the world using natural laws. That actually requires more power. There's more wisdom, there's more strength behind it because of all the things that you'd have to do to pull that off. So Wolff was absolutely certain of this. It was not a maybe for Wolff. It was for sure. God did create the world according to natural laws. There were no miracles except maybe at the very beginning, because that would have required more wisdom, more power on the part of God. It would have required a greater God. Let me read you just a little bit of what Wolff wrote about that. Quote, "The natural way, as the superior way, must always be preferred over the way of miracles, and therefore miracles cannot occur except where God cannot achieve his goal in the natural way." And then Wolff went on to explain that never happens except at the very beginning of the universe, where God puts it all into place at once, and then from then on, there's no miracles. So you can see how this sort of theology can lead to great certainty, and you're just absolutely convinced. That's the point you need to understand, the certainty that you have here, because if Wolff is correct, and Wolff, a leading Lutheran at the time, if he's correct, well, then what does that say about the theory of evolution? What does that say about naturalistic origins? It's pretty much required. There's no other way. One way or another, somehow the world and all the species must have evolved. We may not have any idea how that happened actually, but it must have happened somehow. Now, this idea was also espoused by Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, an early evolutionary kind of thinker who wrote about these ideas about naturalistic origins. So let me read to you a quote from Erasmus. "The world itself might have been generated rather than created. That is, it might have been gradually produced from very small beginnings. What a magnificent idea of the infinite power of the great architect, the cause of causes, parent of parents. For if we may compare infinities, it would seem to require a greater infinity of power to cause the causes of effects than to cause the effects themselves." 1794, Erasmus Darwin. Charles Darwin was influenced by his grandfather and his grandfather's thinking. And you can see in Darwin's notebooks these sort of greater God musings that Darwin wrote to himself. It was also prevalent in Darwin's social circles at the time. And after Darwin wrote the first edition to his book Origin of Species in 1859, he got feedback from an Anglican cleric, Charles Kingsley, again urging this greater God theology. Let me read to you what Kingsley wrote. "We knew of old that God was so wise that he could make all things, but behold, he is so much wiser than even that he can make all things make themselves." And so after Darwin, this just became kind of an accepted given that the greater God is the God who makes a world that makes itself. And you can see the implications for evolutionary theory. Again, this was a very powerful religious doctrine, religious tradition, theological tradition that mandated the theory of evolution. Religion drives science, and it matters.